Yeah, just in ag in general. I mean, there's so many roads to go down. I'll just go down one that I was recently looking at, and a lot of this stuff is part of the Climate Smart projects, which is a $3 billion project that the USDA kind of just created with, I'm sure, their corporate partners, and there's corporations donating into it. They've made this legal. I don't think it was ever legal before, but there was a bill called the Sustains Act, which allows for public-private partnerships. And for people who've ever heard anything about World Economic Forum or any of those kind of places, they all talk about the end goal is a public-private partnership, meaning corporations partner up with the government kind of, and they won't say this, but if you really look at it, the end goal is to control the population.
It's time for Gun and Saddle, a United Country M. Edwards Realty and Auction weekly broadcast where we talk about anything and everything related to our God-fearing country lifestyles and the blood, sweat, and tears that it takes to make them possible. Join Monty Edwards and Carrie Hanlon as they take a deeper look at the land we all love and the people that call it home. This is Gun and Saddle.
I'm happy today to have with me this all-star panel of folks to talk today about our topic, will the Heartland agree to lie? I've got some folks here today that I think really fit this narrative that we're going to have today for our discussion. I first want to welcome Margaret Byfeld, who's been on our podcast before. Margaret is the executive director with American Stewards of Liberty. And if you don't know, Margaret and her group has been instrumental in stopping some things that were big parts of the plan for the 30 by 30 agenda, which not to sound like we've got the war won, but we've won a couple of battles, and Margaret and them have been leading the charge. So thanks for joining us, Margaret.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Tell us just a little bit about your background and how you got into this and kind of what you're still working on right now.
Well, as you know, I was raised on a ranch in Nevada, so we had a big cow-calf operation there, but we were just a target of environmentalists. One of the first things that happened to us was the Forest Service filed over every one of our water rights and used their regulations to run us out of business. So we spent 27 years in court. We actually won a case in the claims court where the court awarded us $14.4 million for the taking of our property. But then that was appealed up to the D.C. Circuit in D.C. and we got before 3 Eastern judges, and that was overturned. So end of the day, we lost the case. We weren't compensated, and we lost the ranch. But that was really, good introduction into these critical property rights issues, and particularly, how little control we as Americans have when the federal government has any kind of control over our property. I think is really the lesson learned, and the reason why we work on these issues and try to stop these agendas today.
Well, I found out about you through United Country and some of my constituents there. Mr. Vaughn Box, I think, was the one that made the initial introduction. And I'm sure he's going to be out there listening to this podcast because we were talking about it the other day. But it's been a pleasure to get to be a part of your group and come on board with you guys. And I want to thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm also really tickled to have with us Jim Mundorf. Jim's new to our podcast. I actually started listening to Jim's podcast a while back, and I listened to the first one I heard, and then I just kept coming back for more. And then when Margaret and I were talking down at the United Country Convention, she actually had been on one of his podcasts, and I asked her if she knew him, and she said yes, and she made an introduction for me. So me and Jim had a good discussion a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him if he would come on and be willing to come on to this podcast and be a part of it with us. And Jim, I know you've got Lonesome Lands, and you've also got your business, Drover House. I'm sorry, I knew I'd get that wrong. But so could tell us a little bit about, where you're at, what you're doing, and really why you're here today to talk with us about this topic.
Yeah, so I'm in Southwest Iowa, a little town called McClellan. I'm about like probably 20 miles east of Omaha, Nebraska. If that gives you a better idea. I grew up on a farm about 40 miles straight east of Omaha, Nebraska, where we had a small feedlot and cow calf. And I still do work there some. My dad and brother and nephew actually are all working on the farm still. But when I went to school for communications and journalism, when I got out, I decided there was no way. Actually, before I got out, I decided there was no way I wanted to do that. Mainly because I didn't want to work with the kind of people that were in that industry. So I started a business called the Drover House, where I get cattle horns and build stuff out of them. And as that progressed, I got a little more free time and thought I would go back to what I wanted to do back in college, which was more of like journalism, writing, stuff like that. And we are at a point now where you can do that if from your home office or anywhere. And so that's where I started with Lonesome Lands. And that was just kind of when I started, it was just kind of put an agriculture voice out there, and I talked about some kind of mainstream issues, and I didn't really know where it would go. And this is where it went, I guess. And it's still definitely a work in progress. It's been real slow, and I've taken time off over the years. It was just kind of a side project, but now it's kind of, I'm trying to work it into my main project, I guess. But yeah, so that's where I'm at.
Well, and a lot of the things that you've been talking about for a while, kind of beating the drum, are now becoming more center stage to a lot of people, I think. I think
Right.
The good thing about one of the topics that we'll talk about today is the fact that it feels like to me we're at a time where we're actually getting more people to listen in regard to some of these issues than maybe in the past. And part of that, I think, is because of a lot of the things that are going on externally around us that have woke us up. But, that's kind of a good segue for me to make my last introduction. And Steve, he's on our podcast he's been on here a couple of times. I actually had him come on a while back, and then he was on with Margaret when she was on before. Today, when we were sitting here getting ready, we were talking about, the backgrounds that each of you had. And he said, well, these guys are the experts. I'm not the expert. And I said, no, actually, you are going to be our expert on truth. I said, because you're always talking to people about, living in truth. And, those of you that don't know Steve's background, I mean, he's a very well-known horse auctioneer and livestock auctioneer, but he's also very well known for I wouldn't call it a podcast, but a Facebook Live deal he started during COVID, which is called Coffee with the Colonel. And Steve also, because I know this because I have the privilege of getting to sit and listen to him a lot. He's also a really good preacher and a Bible teacher. So, we brought him in because I want to talk about in one aspect when we get to a point today, how we got here. And, I don't really think that we can start to go the correct direction until we realize how we got off course. And so I'm really excited to have you here, Steve. And again, I know a lot of the people listening know who you are, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, there's not that much to tell, but you covered it all. We own a horse sale. We run a horse sale. I auctioneer horse sales all over the country and done it for the last 40 years. It created a platform that COVID-19 opened up an opportunity to speak to the heartland of America. So we've spent the last 4 years speaking biblical truth to the heartland of America, the Western way of life. We understand that agriculture and the Western way of life is the lifeblood of this country, and we strive to maintain freedom. We also know that the Pharaohistic characteristics of our government are enslaving people, and that's not going to work. The Bible is very clear on how to avoid that, and they're also very clear on how to escape it. And so I guess if I got any voice in that, that's where that'll kind of happen. So.
Well, I think that over time, over the last few years, it's been apparent to me that if we've done anything, a lot of times the truth bearers in this country, the people that do stand on truth, they've been kind of isolated and kind of been put in their boxes, and they've been asked to kind of keep that in a certain area of their life. And what we're seeing is, if we look back in our history, the history of our country was that we had men that were, not just making changes on where they went to church, but where they lived, what they did. They went across oceans in boats, and they weren't travelers. They weren't guys that were looking to be explorers. They were actually looking for something that they had to go somewhere else to find because they had lost it where they were. And so, I think that's one of the reasons when Margaret first came on last year and she started talking to us about these conservation easements, it kind of opened my eyes to understanding that we're in a world today where we're actually kind of combating an evil force that it's hard to put a name and a face on it. But it's all about trying to make people think they're doing the right things. In essence, they're running into a trap of giving up the things that they say they're standing for. And I don't think there's a better example of that than the way a lot of people perceive the conservation easements. Because I talk to people over and over again, and if you're out there and you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm going to let Margaret go into more detail about that. But I think overall, probably even for myself, the first few years when I was hearing about conservation easements, I didn't really think they were something that I would want to be a part of. But I could see the point in what some people were saying on why they were doing what they were doing. And I'd like to let Margaret just talk to us some, just to kind of tee this up first about that. Margaret, if a person, just a month ago, I was in the car with a group of people and somebody said something about some land being put into a conservation easement. And one of the people said, well, if you're in one of these areas that's on the edge of development, it's a really good way to protect your land from it being developed and chopped up into pieces and made into something that you wouldn't want to see happen to land that you own. Is that what you hear a lot from people that kind of get taken in by the conservation easement talk?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key pressures. And, my first question is, well, if you own it, I mean, I think it was Shad Sullivan who said, nobody has to pay me to take care of my land. So, if you own it, you're the one who would make that decision on whether or not it's going to be developed or not. So what they're really talking about is they don't want to see the next generation do that, or they don't want to sell it, and they don't want to see the buyer put it into development. So, I mean, that perspective I think is a little bit confusing, but I think ultimately it does come from that perspective of they just don't want to see their land developed, and they want it to stay in open space. But most of the time, I think that what courts the landowner on it is it comes with a financial incentive. So they're thinking, I want to leave this piece of land to my kids, but the estate taxes are so high that I don't know if they will be able to keep the property, or if they're going to have to sell off part of the property to pay the estate tax. So I think that goes through a lot of landowners' mind, and that's where they're thinking, if I put the conservation easement on, then they can't develop it and it can't be broken up. But there's so many problems with conservation easements. You have to understand that, unlike you're a realtor, when you go and you sell a piece of property, you have full disclosure. You have to tell the potential buyer, seller, the good, bad, the ugly about that property. It's full disclosure. A land trust doesn't have to do that. A land trust is not a broker. So what they do is they come out and they say, look, we have a way to help you keep your land forever in open space. And we'll actually even be able to pay you something for doing that, or you'll get the income tax break, estate tax break. And so the landowner starts thinking, wow, this sounds really good. I can do everything I am doing today. And so they basically buy the dream before they see the contract. And you know how that goes, that once you've already sold the money, you've already dreamed how your kids are going to take it over. Then when you see the actual contract, you can start, basically kind of saying, well, I don't really like this, but you're already so sold and bought into it that you tend to sign on the dotted line. But the key thing to understand about a conservation easement is it transfers control of your property to the land trust or the government. Now, they'll tell you this is private property. You are still in control of your property. You can still do everything that you're doing today. The problem with that is you have to write into that contract what you think you might want to do with that property in the future. So if your kids may want to come back and build a home on the property, when you sign that contract, you better make sure you cut out a spot in that contract where you can put one more house on that property. Otherwise, you can't do it. So they create a baseline. When you sign the contract, that baseline is all the activity that is occurring today can continue. But how many pieces of property could really function, survive, still be a working economic unit that can provide for a family, that is stagnant. You always have to improve your operation with technology, just with changes in the landscape and other things. You have to be flexible on your land. You have to make different decisions all the time to make sure it's properly managed. Well, the conservation easement freezes that. So that's one problem. But what probably the key thing landowners don't understand is they're really signing something called a conservation servitude, meaning they have sold control of their property to the land trust or the government, and they now have primary control. There's something called the conservation purpose, which is now the primary dominant purpose for the land, which the land trust or government controls. So what we like to tell people is it may be private property when you put it into a conservation easement, but once you put the conservation easement in, it's no longer private property because you no longer control the land, and that's the fundamental element of property.
And, one of the comments that I heard from another broker just the other day was that he was getting ready to list a property that someone had put into a conservation easement. He was looking at an appraisal on it, and there was already a 40% deduction in value by that appraiser because of that conservation easement. And that's today still with a pretty good public perception of what conservation easements are to the general public. And I remember talking to Dan about this the other day, and he opened my eyes to the idea, or something that I didn't realize, but if the holder of those easements actually ends up buying that property, they can actually do away with all the easements because the idea behind a servitude is that someone else holds it. So if the value gets drove down to a point that, we're looking at some point someday where these are 20 cents on the dollar, 10 cents on the dollar, these land trusts can come back in and buy that and then actually do whatever they want with the land. In theory, I know that's not necessarily something we're seeing, but that was an eye-opening thought to me. I hadn't even really thought about that aspect of it.
Yeah, you can't hold an easement against yourself. And we asked this question of Representative Harriet Hagman, who's a land attorney. And in one of our conversations on conservation easement, I said, okay, you're an attorney, so tell me, this is our understanding. We've heard this from other attorneys that this is correct. Is that correct from your understanding? She said, absolutely. That easement goes away, which means they can develop, they can do whatever they want with that land if they are able to get a hold of the easement and the land itself. And, the easement, like you say, devalues the property by 40%, and that's pretty universal. Department of Nebraska, Department of Revenue, they also did a study, and they found that the wetlands conservation easement devalues the property by 40%. So I think that's a pretty good figure. And, but you have to think about, where does that value go? So 40% of the value of the land, it didn't just evaporate, it went somewhere, and it went on the land trust balance sheet. So if you go to the land trust, whatever land trust is in your area, you look up their 990s, you're going to see a line item of the value that they own in conservation easements. So the landowner they selling control of their property, but they're selling off the most valuable part of their property as well. And it's just, when you really peel back all the layers of the conservation easement, it becomes more apparent that this is not for the benefit of the landowner. This is a way to control the property for conservation. And that's what we're seeing come to a head, and how all of that's going to play out through the 30 by 30 agenda and the natural asset company agenda, that we recently fought. So they are probably one of the most deceptive devices that landowners have really had to face, because on the surface, they sound good, they feel good. But when you peel back all the layers, they have become the primary tool to erode property rights in America. And that's pretty scary for what we're able to leave to future generations.
No, I agree. Do either one of y'all have any questions for Margaret with anything she's covering here? Any points you would like to bring out for our viewers or people that would be listening to this?
Well, I just thought, as you were talking about that 40% reduction, like that's actually like a 40% discount if you hold the easement. Because if you hold the easement, you still have 100% of that land value because you can buy it at a 40% discount. And then, you know what I mean? Like, as a realtor, I'm
Good
sure you know
point.
what I mean, but yeah, I mean, that's
no.
the land actually has a lot more value for the people who actually own the easement. So it would make sense for them to actually end up controlling it.
And Jim, talking about it, looking at it from that perspective, I mean, when we look over here on the other side of the issue, when we get into some of the stuff that you've really been talking a lot about, which is the ESG move or the ESG policy being pushed down the supply chain, environmental social governance, for those of y'all who don't know what that stands for. But when you've got those issues, those type things, that is the way that's being presented to folks is, hey, here's an incentive by giving you a premium or a discount to people that don't take part so that you be a first mover, get in on this and be the guy that gets the extra money for your beef because you're tracking carbon emissions. And I remember hearing you talk about that on one of your podcasts. I think it was actually one where you were at that conference, but I kind of stole your title for this podcast from there because you said, will cattlemen agree to the lie? I believe was the name of it or something similar to
Right.
that. And, it all comes down to a point that Steve and I were talking about before we started today. And I was talking to a gentleman the other day, and we were driving around looking at some land, and we were talking about these things, and he goes, we're going to have to quit taking their money. That was just his visceral response. He goes, we've got to start looking at where we're taking money for things that we shouldn't. And, we're going to jump back and forth between these issues, but Jim, I mean, talk a little bit about, I've heard you talk about this some, but how you think that's going to be kind of pushed down that supply chain, and just give us kind of a brief overview of what you think's happening right here with this ESG stuff in the beef packing industry.
Yeah, and well, just in ag in general, I mean, there's so many roads to go down. I'll just go down one that I was recently looking at, and a lot of this stuff is part of the Climate Smart projects, which is a $3 billion project that the USDA kind of just created with, I'm sure, their corporate partners, and there's corporations donating into it. They've made this legal. I don't think it was ever legal before, but there was a bill called the Sustains Act, which allows for public-private partnerships. And for people who've ever heard anything about World Economic Forum or any of those kind of places, they all talk about the end goal is a public-private partnership, meaning corporations partner up with the government, kind of, and they won't say this, but if you really look at it, the end goal is to control the population. Just control what everyone's doing. And a good example of that, one of the Climate Smart projects that I haven't talked about a whole lot, but I was just reading about it yesterday. It's called, I think it's Field to Market. It's an organization or a corporation, I'm not sure which, because I just started looking into it, but their project is to create bank finance incentives for people who are involved in these Climate Smart project. So if you're working your farm or your ranch the way that they want you to, you'll get a reduced interest rate on your operating loan. Also, part of that Climate Smart part of that project is also I think it's BIPOC, which is they call Black, Indigenous, People of Color, I think is that acronym. But if you're one of those, if you're a minority, then you're also going to get incentives and be kind of the main people they're looking to partner up with to get these government money and reduced interest rates and all that kind of stuff. And so that goes into just kind of this whole woke culture that they're trying to push and really force, on this Field to Market. The website, they talk about, DEI, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, which is, my definition of that is focusing on race. I talk about how I grew up in the 90s, and the goal back then was to treat everyone as equals, the golden rule, and not to see skin color. And if you meet someone of a different race, you treat them just like anybody. But now with DEI, the goal is to focus on skin color and focus on race, and it was even on this thing about how they need to accept the indiscretions they've had, even if they don't realize them, towards these minorities, just kind of crazy stuff like that you're always concentrating on what race everyone is, or gender, or any of those kind of things. And that's just the way they're kind of pushing this into agriculture, and it's crazy. And what I really want is people to start realizing that this is happening, and when they're involved in, they get involved with these companies that are pushing the solar and the wind and all that kind of stuff. I mean, even the beef packing industry, where I first came across this ESG stuff in agriculture was Tyson Foods, and they're the biggest packer in the country, or U.S. owned packer. And so, and you get into, like, you guys, as you were talking about the conservation easements, there was a podcast put out last week, and I know part of this deal, what I'm doing is you talk about the lie, and people that are, it's a lot about indoctrination, and that's where we're pushing in agriculture. National Cattlemen's Beef Association, I was going to say, part of the deal with talking about these things is you end up stepping on some toes, and there have been people who've been National Cattlemen's Beef Association for a long time. Texas Southwest Cattle Raisers are an affiliate. Texas Cattle Feeders are an affiliate. But NCBA is they have an ESG kind of plan on their website, and they're bought into this because they're controlled by these corporations, Tyson Foods and the rest of them. And as Margaret was talking, they put out a podcast last week about the benefits. I'll just read it to you. This is NCBA's, their description of their podcast. On this episode, we talked to Rangeland Trust and Texas Ag Land Trust about process producers go through to establish a conservation easement, what the limitations are, where opportunities lie, and how easements protect working lands. That is the number one cattle. There's all these, I hate to call them the biggest cattlemen's organization, because they're not a cattlemen's organization in my eyes, but also, their numbers are all kind of screwy. But that is a cattlemen's organization that calls themselves a grassroots, corporation, and they're working with these corporations and different people to tell people how easements protect working lands, what Margaret just described right there. And it just goes back into this indoctrination of, they're really working hard to get these ideas pushed into agriculture and accepted by people, agreeing to the lie, you agree to these things. And so that's kind of, I guess I went kind of on a tangent there, but I think it's important for people to realize how, how this is, when they see these kind of things, what they actually are.
Well, and one of the things that I think is interesting to me is how this is being pushed as this is social governance, but yet it's coming from government, or it's coming from corporate America, and big multinational corporations pushing this, and then saying it's coming from the consumer. Because one of the revealing conversations I've had here recently with some of the guys that are in the beef industry is that they're kind of speaking with this tone of, well, this is just the way it is. The consumer is demanding these type things. And I'm like, who? What consumers are demanding this? I told a guy the other day, I said, I don't think there's going to be any picket lines outside any grocery stores over any of this ESG stuff, but there could be some out there because stuff's getting too expensive, or they can't get what they need. And, it seems like we've always, in the past, I was an animal production major when I went to school, and grew up on a working farm and ranch. And I always thought that it was supposed to be affordable, available, and safe. That was what we tried to strive for in ag, was, have a readily available food source that's affordable and available. And safe. Safety was always a big issue. We had a lot of these things that we're doing, even with regulatory stuff, was always in the name of safety. And now it's like this lie. One of the things I think we're being taught is, and we're teaching our kids, if we're not careful, or we're sending them off and handing them off to people that are teaching them this, is that this is a safety issue. The planet's not safe because of what we're doing. And Jim, you brought up something in one of your deals I heard you talking about that was just, it was something I already knew, but just hearing you say it, I needed to hear somebody say it. When you talked about John Kerry, sitting there in 1990, I believe it was 1990, but, stating that by the year 2000, the world was going to be a certain way. And that was what they ran with until they got to the year 2000. And then they just modified and moved their story down the storyline. And then today we're hearing those same guys stand up and tell us, oh, it's a lot worse than we thought. And, and, you use that time machine analogy. If you could go back to yourself, to that 1990 something self, and talk about this, that you'd be asking yourself now saying, well, it's got to be over. Surely you guys have figured out these guys are lying to you. But here we are. So, right. And I'd like to bring Steve in on that because, I think we've been talking about these, and you brought up the indoctrination, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's 100% where we're losing this battle right now. And, we're handing off our future generations, I think, in a lot of ways to our academic areas, and they're being funded by a lot of this money. Jim, tell me again, you were using one of those universities, but just to give our listeners the idea of the kind of money some of these research universities are getting out of that climate smart bill. Could you give us just an example?
Well, I gave the talk in South Dakota, so I focused on their school, which happened to be the largest. They got the largest amount of money out of the Climate Smart project. So South Dakota State, they got $80 million from, and at the time I wasn't as familiar with I forget what they called it, but it's the corporate fund too. So they got $80 million from the government, and then they got $80 million from the corporate, the private partnership of it also. So they got $160 million for their project. And their project was to create the climate smart beef or low carbon beef. And it goes towards, there's a company up there that's making these machines that are supposed to measure methane emissions coming off of the cattle. And it's all just kind of craziness. But yeah, I mean, I think I counted 27 different schools, colleges and universities, and then they're not all land grant. I mean, it goes to Yale, Clemson, all kinds of, and I'm pretty sure Texas A&M is in there. I don't think Texas Tech was on there, but yeah, it's definitely going into it, and I think this program's into every school out there, and so when your kids are going to college and they're going to learn, well, the way to make money in agriculture is to sign up for these deals, and so
and that's why I wanted to bring Steve in, because one of the things I know Steve's been going around the country talking about is, don't hand your kids off. Take your responsibility if you're raising a family is to teach your kids right from wrong and teach them to be discerning people, to sit and ask questions about things and look for answers. So, Steve, I mean, you're listening to all this. Is this, I've got to think there's a lot going on in your mind as you're listening to these guys talk.
Well, it's all about the lie. And in the lie with money tied to it all creates compromise. There's been plenty of compromise in South Dakota. I happen to have a little bit of connection up there. CO2 pipeline stuff, you're compromised. If you play any part of that, you're compromised. If you're a politician who everybody loves in the doors and we send you to the big house all of a sudden and somebody gets in your ear and then gets in your pocket, all of a sudden you're compromised. Well, the very first compromise happened in the garden in the very beginning of time. It was artificial intelligence, artificial information. Mm-hmm. When Satan himself said, I didn't really mean that. There's a better way to do this. And so all of a sudden, here you go. And so we continue to buy into the lie. We continue to allow ourselves to be compromised. One of the biggest compromises I've seen in my lifetime in agriculture, I grew up in a sale barn since I was a little kid. But the CRP program, for crying out loud, it's a disaster. And then without saying too much about it, because I'm hardly really close to this whole situation, in just the last few months, we burned 1.1 acres of land, ranch land across our northern panhandle and into the Oklahoma. We need CRP. We got to put some cattle somewhere. Mm-hmm. And the red tape and the state of Texas was the worst because of a freaking prairie chicken. I mean, go ahead and arrest me, throw me in jail. I know how to fix a prairie chicken problem. I'm not going to say that here. But the truth of the matter is, because of all this government control, and that's all it is, it's about control and manipulation. The key to that is indoctrination. The church has been the main, they've been the first. We're the first. We indoctrinate the kids, and then it becomes corporate, and then it becomes control. And it's a Babylonian model. Suck it out of the bottom and send it to the top. And that's just how that works. And so in America today, our forefathers, they never saw this coming. But the first mistake we made was when Thomas Jefferson revised the John Locke version of the Declaration of Independence. Instead of the pursuit of happiness, it was the ownership of a state. But the ownership of a state is what gives you control in your community, in your life. If you own your own home, you can raise your own family and do your own thing. And when we neglected that, and then here's another one, they'll shoot me plumb off the porch for this one. But when landowners quit being the sole voters, listen, you got no skin in the game. My opinion, shut up and get out of the game. And so I'm sorry if you don't own anything, but in America you could have. But so this land ownership and then the land grab to get it back, to get the control over all these things, everything these guys are talking about. I'm not well versed in all those subjects they're talking about. But I'm going to tell you, in Genesis 12, God made a promise to Abraham and said he'd give him a place to raise his family. He'd give him a land to live in. When Joshua stepped across the the Jordan, he placed his foot, and the Lord said, I'll give you this wherever you place your foot. Wherever you place your foot. The land is a part of God's creation in the kingdom, and it's where we live. And if you don't believe in a creator, you're probably one of them indoctrinated fools that think boys can kiss boys and make another boy. That's all silliness. It's
Right.
all a lie. It's all a lie. So
well, and it's saving the planet. I mean, we're looking at a situation where that's really been the deal for kids. I mean, my kids are 30 and 28 now, and I look at some of the things that they learned in school, and I'm by no means saying that we did everything right. But I do think one thing we did do is we did sit around the kitchen table a lot and talk about what they were learning at school. And I talked to a gentleman the other day, and he said, I don't think the answer is for us to withdraw from society as being, people that see truth and want to stand for what's right. He said, I think it's the opposite. He said, I think we've got to charge into the world, and, we've got to be salt and light. We talk about this, and you're talking about being a light in a dark room. And how do you do that? And how do you raise a generation that's going to continue to do that? Well, I think one of the first things that we've got to do is we've got to understand this is not going to be easy. And I don't think what Margaret's doing is easy. I don't think what Jim's talking about is easy. I know, like Jim brought up the point that, hey, there's a lot of great people that started some of these organizations that right now have kind of got off and they're going the wrong direction. There's a lot of great guys sitting on a lot of boards that don't see things any different than you and I, but they're sitting in boardrooms, and I don't know that they're even really talking about these things in depth. I think it's just getting pushed across the table. And I think that, one of the big things that we can do, because, when you sit around and you talk about these things, you got to be careful, or you just sit around and talk about them. And, Steve and I were talking about this the other day. What do we do? I was talking to Margaret, talked to Jim, same question. What do we do? And it is a hard question to know the exact answer for. But I think one thing that we do, and the reason we have a deal like today that we're doing, is I want people to hear this. Some people haven't heard this. I mean, they don't know what ESG is. They think it's just another acronym that they just, when they hear it, it goes right over their head. And I think that's kind of the way it's designed. I hope you don't know what that means. Just let us take care of it. I thought Vivek Ramaswamy, whether you agree with him or not, did a great job this last year, because he made a lot of young people think about things that they weren't thinking about before. And I think that's critical for us to turn this boat around and keep things going the right, or get things going the right direction, is that, it's a good thing to ask questions. And for me, over the last 4 to 5 years, COVID was a period of time in our little area where I think we learned that we need to ask questions. We need to not just take the status quo and go along with whatever we're told, because it's not that everybody's trying to deceive you. I'm not a full hat wearing conspiracy theorist, but sometimes groupthink is not the right way to get to the place you need to go. And, Margaret, back to your conservation easement deal. And then Steve jumped over to an area that I did want to talk about a little bit more, which was tied to what Jim was talking about, which is the climate smart stuff that was in that. Was it in the omnibus? It wasn't in the omnibus bill. It was in the Inflation Reduction Act. Was it? Is that correct? Is that when when did the climate smart stuff? It didn't really get voted on, did it? That money?
No, that was another main issue. It was just created by the USDA, and it comes out of I always forget the fund it comes out of, but it's called commodity. It's the CCC. It stands for Commodity Corporation. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's really a fund for relief for agriculture. So like your wildfire, or Trump used it a lot for he dug into it, which you can agree with or not, but for his tariffs and in his trade deals, he sent out relief checks for that. But yeah, so the USDA just took the $3 billion out of that and just sent it out to whoever. They worked with people, had to apply, and it was a long process. And I didn't really know that much about it until I kind of stumbled onto it, which it had been out for a year by the time I started looking at it. So.
Well, and one of the points that I think is worth noting is that it sounded like when it came out, it was going to be a deal where any of us could go and apply for it too, and we'd get some of this money, but it actually all went to the big players in ag. It didn't go to the individuals. It was money that was taken that usually used to help the individuals, but it got used at a much higher level. Isn't that right?
Yeah. One of the big names that's in it a lot is PepsiCo. Like they're in the one that I was just talking about. And that goes back to what a corrupt system we actually have right now. When you look at who has the lobbyists in DC, and then they just pull this $3 billion out, they give it to whoever they feel like, ADM, I think, is the second largest ag corporation in the world. And they got one of the biggest, they got $90 million for their project. And so, yeah, it's just a handout once you start looking into this, it's really kind of daunting and overwhelming of how corrupt really things are.
Well, I think one of the hills though that you're standing on, Jim, is you're doing a great job by showing us all these different areas. But then I think we can take that and go to maybe our little corner of the world, and maybe I know someone that's in one particular area of this that has some influence, that's standing in a leadership role somewhere that can make a difference on these issues, sitting in a boardroom, maybe in an association or a group, because I just don't believe we've lost all these groups. I think that there's still good people sitting around those board tables that understand that, like, for instance, with the supply chain, that the people that are supplying their groups with product, mainly beef, like in the beef cattle one, or if you're a producer in agriculture, like in row crop. I was talking to a row crop farmer the other day, and, I feel like sometimes at the row crop deal, the horse is out of the barn a little bit further maybe than I used to with the beef cattle. I don't know if that's still the case now, but, he was just making the comment. It was that same kind of inevitability that I was hearing come out of his voice that, well, we're just going to have to allow this. We're going to have to work around this. And I was like, I think we need to see this as a liberty issue. We have a right to do what is right, and nobody can take that away from us. I tell some guys that I deal with sometimes, I said, liberty is not the right to do whatever you want. Liberty is the right to do what's right, no matter what. Yeah, do what you're supposed to do. And your standard for that, everybody has to decide what's going to be their standard. I know where my standard sits, but the reality of it is that we have a right to do what's right, and we have an obligation actually to do what's right. And so I think a lot of it is, I know a lot of guys that really believe that way, but they've been getting by with not doing what's right because they just haven't thought about it. They haven't just really took time to think about, where's this money going? What's this money being used for? What is this program that I'm taking revenue for? That's not popular stuff for me to be bringing up either. But the reality of it is, if my grandkids are going to have a place to live and a house to live in someday, I believe we're going to have to start ruffling a few feathers with folks and talking about things that make people uncomfortable. And I mean, do you guys agree with that from where y'all stand? I mean, what do y'all think?
Well, I agree 100%. And when we talk about where do we fight this, it really starts at home.
There you go.
And, I look at the landowners, America's landowners, private landowners are really our gate of defense on all of these issues. And, the whole 30 by 30 agenda, the Biden administration tells you it's all voluntary. And when it comes to the private land programs, it's all voluntary. They are throwing a net of federal nexus over our private property right today because landowners are voluntarily signing up for these conservation programs. And so, we're doing it to ourselves. And that's, I think, the key thing. And they're thinking, how am I going to make, my crop next year? How am I going to fund this? And they really need to think long term. What is this doing overall to our nation as we erode these property rights? I'll bring up something that probably, it's very sensitive. And I kind of hate bringing it up, but one of the first things I did, with the fires in the Panhandle, is I knew the lesser prairie chicken was in there. So I knew there was habitat in there, which means that area is not going to be properly managed because when you list a species for critical habitat, it's managed for that species. Well, that's one entity out there. There's a lot of other things going on that piece of land. And so the private landowner, without any federal encumbrances, is going to manage that land differently so that everything out there benefits, not just one species. And so, just knowing some of the prohibitions that they have on those grouse species when they're endangered, like greater sage grouse, lesser prairie chicken, you can't properly manage that. You can create a fire situation because you have to protect that species. But the other thing that I looked at on the map is I just went to the USDA CRP site, the Conservation Reserve site, and I pulled up their latest data map of where all of the conservation program dollars are going for CRP in America. And the largest concentration of CRP dollars in Texas was in the Panhandle, right in that area. And so, they call these programs conservation, but they're not good land management. That's letting the ground go fallow is not good management. And that's really what the CRP program encourages. And so, I think a lot of things contributed to that, but I do think the Panhandle was more vulnerable because it had so many of these federal programs in there. And I think that's really important for landowners to be thinking about. The other thing that the Biden administration did was they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, what you're thinking of, Monty. And that's where, they are creating, and utilizing the climate smart verbiage in these programs, but they've taken things like the Conservation Stewardship Program, and they leave the name the same, but they've actually changed the underlying purpose of the program so that now instead of helping to improve agriculture, they're actually doing it to mitigate climate change, mitigate livestock emissions, and control agriculture production. So completely flipping the purpose, but they didn't change the name, and that's been true with the agriculture conservation easement. So they poured a ton of money into this. So, and additionally, and we're getting ready to write on this in Thursday's Liberty Matters, but one of the recent USDA announcements is that they are giving out, I think it's I can't remember the number, $15 billion. I think it might be. I'll have to go back and look at the number. A ton of money that they're giving to the regional conservation program. It's RCPP, and I need to go look this up to get you the right acronym, but it is the program inside USDA where they give grant dollars to environmental groups to go out and put these conservation easements on. So the federal government is spending a ton of money to give to the land trusts to then go, put the guilt trip on mom and pop farm that's financially struggling to put a conservation easement on. So it's there's so much pressure coming at the landowners, but at the end of the day, we as landowners, we just have to suck it up and say it starts at home. We change things
Amen.
first on our own piece of property, and that's how we can change it in our community. That's how we can change it in our state. That's how we can change it nationally.
Well, and to your point too, I think and again, going back to another issue, something that we went through the last few years with COVID, it did open the eyes of a lot of folks to like how important county government is. Steve had a deal. He was going around, he was talking county by county, but your sheriff in your county has a tremendous amount of ability to defend your constitutional rights. I was talking to one of my guys that's a commissioner. I said, I know that most people even call them road commissioners, but they've got a lot of important jobs, and it's not just keeping the roads bladed. Some of these things that we're looking at is they come down the pipe and they challenge our freedoms. I think where we're going to have to effectively start to win these battles first is in our county, because in that county, we can win a court case, and it may have to go up the chain, but we have to be ready to fight those battles at home. And we need to be thinking about, guys, when we're electing people for these jobs, putting people in those roles that understand these things, because I think that's probably one of the more effective ways we can do something from a legal standpoint in the state of Texas. I know, and I think in Jim and Iowa, it's probably the same way. I mean, your counties are powerful if they really take control of everything that they actually are in charge of.
There's a big push for wind up here, and my county luckily has a really grassroots effort that has pushed back on it. And so these companies that come in and they sit down in everybody's living room and show them the contracts, and those kind of things. Well, now they're in the county next to us. They're going kind of around us. But that is, your county supervisors, there's all kinds of things. But then you look at South Dakota, and what they've done there is they've gotten it to where the counties have no power. So that's something you also have to be wary of when you elect these, your state representatives. That's what they did, is they voted to make, all of the land like setbacks and regulations that this carbon pipeline would have to deal with. They made that to where counties have no say over that anymore, and they just did that within the last month. And that's all from lobbyist money. And this Summit Carbon Solutions is so entrenched in the government. I mean, they have people who've worked for them are now on these governors' staffs of Iowa and South Dakota. It is really corrupt how they work, but yeah, I agree with what you're saying is starting things at home, really. And I think, one thing that pops back into my mind a lot is I don't know my Bible like Steve does, but I keep thinking, I saw something about how there was somebody talking about how there's such a push now for solar, wind, and carbon and all these things on people's lands. And I know there's people who are kind of like searching their heart, they think about where they come from and where we're going, and they know the right decision. You know what I mean? I think they know the right decision, but what's popped into my head a few times is building your house on a rock or building it in the sand, your foundation. And I'm looking at these ranches right now and thinking, these wind and solar and power, you own your land so you can make money off your land. It's not so some other corporation can come in and make money off your land, unless you would just want to be a landlord and you don't want to be involved in what's going on. And I think that can maybe be used as, it can't be described as anything else. As if you want to build your property with solar and wind and these things that are unproven, and that they're not really reliable energy sources. You are building your ranch or farm or whatever on a foundation of sand, and it's not going to last.
If a guy wanted to put a wind turbine on his property to collect wind energy and make electricity, I think he's got a right to do that. I think he's got a right to sign a wind contract. But I think it's just like up in the Dakotas, what you get into is, but now we've got to go across this other land to make this feasible. And now we're involving people that don't want to do it. And we're grabbing things like eminent domain and saying, oh, we have to do this. And, I'm not defending any of it. But when you start doing, you trying to use eminent domain for carbon sequestration, that's just insane, because that's not something that's producing anything that they've, and it's still in a theory. I mean, we still have to say climate theory. They haven't got to nail that down to say it's climate. I mean, I know someone will say climate science, but the reality of it is back to this deal about agreeing to the lie. When we look at where we're going with a lot of these things, what are we headed towards? Who's benefiting from this? I think the one difference when you look at it from a creationist viewpoint is that we are given dominion over this planet as a responsibility. And stewardship is something that goes along with ownership. And, when we're sitting here talking about worrying about the future legacy that comes after us, we care about these things more than someone who's just wanting to leave it to someone else. And I've always been the type person that I don't want to leave somebody else in charge of my responsibilities. I want to be the one that takes responsibility, or if I have to answer for something, I want to be the one that takes the action, because I don't want to be answering for somebody else's actions if I'm responsible. And I know Steve's talked about this a lot, and I know we're running long on time, but I mean, this is really an issue, I think, for homes and for people. And Margaret, I love how you dialed that in, and Jim, what you were saying. I think we're at a unique time, though, because I do think, whether we realize it or not, because there's a lot that you can get kind of down about talking about this stuff. But there are some things that we need to be paying attention to right now. I think the country needs to be paying attention to what's happened with companies like Walt Disney, what's happened to companies like Bud Light, who took an idea and tried to cram it down the throat of their consumer and say it was what their consumer wanted. And all the while it was coming from the other direction. And there was a monetary punishment for that came from the average ordinary person who was buying that product. And I think that's one of the things, if we could just have one of these people in each one of these industries where capitalism and competition, where we could have some choice, where like guys that are growing beef cattle have a choice on, and I was talking I don't know that we're going to have that, but, in the areas where we could still have choice, where there's some people running bigger companies that understand that, hey, we need to make smart decisions here, because people may vote with their pocketbooks. And I think that's something that we've kind of lost. I remember as a kid, growing up in a Christian home, that my parents used to vote with their pocketbooks. Like, they didn't buy products from companies that were doing things that they didn't agree with, big things. And, we've been kind of taught nowadays that that's bigotry to do that. You can't go out and not buy somebody's product just because you don't like what they're using the money you give them for. Well, that's insane. Of course we can. So
Monty, can I shed a little hope in this?
Yes, that's what we need.
Well, because we're doing the David and Goliath thing.
Yeah.
Goliath stood over there, big dumb ogre, had no covenant with God, flapping his yap, and all the Israelites are standing around there in their fancy uniforms, and they're all having a meeting, and they're all having a board meeting, and they're all having a discussion, and nobody will kill the freaking giant. Okay? Then this little guy comes out of the country. He comes out of nowhere, comes down, and he knows how to handle it. Now, we're not talking about killing the government. We're not talking about any of that. But just what Margaret said, and this is the thing we've been talking about forever, is in my home, in my domain, I get to decide. And listen, there's a thing in America that when something goes awry, there's an opportunity that comes. And there are people in America who think outside the box. There's people in America who don't just stand around and bitch about our government all the time. There's people in America that know that you can get up. There's 2 4:30s, and you can be up before everybody else, and you can go do stuff. I've got a friend in Georgia, population 2,000 in his town, who has now built his own packing house. He raised his own cattle. He's got his own meat market. He's killing it. He doesn't need a government check. He does not have a bend in the bill of his hat from looking in the mailbox every month. And he just continues to do and to do better. And look, the consumer will find him. 44 cattle company. You just go down the deal. You got these private entrepreneurs that are selling their beef, and it's pure. They're purifying the system by getting the contaminated people out of it. Now, I don't know what I can do about a CO2 pipeline that's running across the northern part of our United States of America. I don't know exactly how to do that other than just with my vote. But as for me and my house, we get to decide. And let me tell you one of the things that I've enjoyed about being part of the equine industry, $16 billion industry in the state of Texas alone. We don't have anybody to lobby for us. And when COVID comes and they kick your hind end for about $100,000 right there in the first 2 hours, we don't have a place to go get a rebate. We don't have a place to go. You just suck it up, Buttercup, and you go do your thing. And me and my family sit down and we figure out how to do this, as we've done many times over the last 4 decades. There's a part of America that still knows how to do this, and we don't need a congressman to help us. We don't need a buffoon like Joe Biden to help us. We don't need a lobbyist. We just, with the assistance of the Lord and the ability to work and the intelligence to do it, when there's an opportunity comes, we can create opportunity for me and my family. And we teach that generationally at our home. When the school system don't work, we bring them home and teach them. If college education is what they need to be a brain surgeon, good. But if they're just going to weld pipe fence, we got a way to do that too. Mm-hmm. We teach them how to pay for their stuff and be a lender, not a borrower. There's creative ways to do finance without selling your soul. There's a lot of positive things in the United States of America. The ones that are on TV every week, no, that hurt the idiots. You don't have, but just good old normal folks.
Yeah.
And that's the light in this. That's the light. Go home, create your deal, be generational about it. Don't sell your soul. Don't compromise, and you'll be fine.
And, when we're sitting here and you look at the title of what we're going to be looking at on this podcast, Will the Heartland Agree to Lie? That's kind of the point of what we're trying to get across today to people is what you do in your home with your family is really what determines the outcome in the big picture. I mean, where because I don't think we can miss, how did we get here? We kind of stopped worrying about a lot of that. When I say we, I'm abstractly just talking about as a country. So, just like over the last couple of years, as we've seen, some people stepping up and speaking out about things, you start doing that. I heard Steve say this. You start doing this if you start thinking about how it's going to impact your family. That's what makes you start being motivated to take action on these things, to do something, because that's got to be the focus. And I know most of you know this, but I mean, the most sacred relationship that we have on this planet is the relationship between the husband and the wife and them producing godly offspring. And that's compared to the relationship we have with our Lord Jesus Christ. And, when we talk about that marriage relationship, it's talking about the husband and the wife. And you carry that into how you relate to everything in this world. And if you are willing to sacrifice, as men, if we stand up and we die to ourselves and we do what we, and I don't mean die like you said, going out necessarily physically dying, but I mean dying to our pride, dying to our comfort, doing the things that we've got to do to take a hard stance on these issues. And then all the while understanding something, this is what we're supposed to be doing. And I think the hope comes from understanding that. So I hope that I didn't ramble on too much about that, but Steve kind of got me fired up there talking like that. And
listen, Monty, the truth's not easy.
No, it's not. It's not.
And so when you raise a society that acts like water and migrates to the lowest point, now we're in trouble.
Yeah. And I think that, it's interesting. It's a cool thing that we live in a world today too, where we have this connectivity that we've got. Cause you can get down on the internet, you can get down on technology, but then you look and see all 4 of us sitting in different parts of the country today, able to talk and converse. And some of the things that I've heard over the last couple of months that's opened my eyes to some things I needed to be paying attention to, they came from a podcast that Jim put out. Mm-hmm. I didn't know Jim. I was listening to one of Jim's podcasts the other day, and he had a ag reporter that I believe it was Amanda Radke. Is that correct? Amanda Radke. That
yep.
She was a journalist, a staff journalist for one of the big outfits that actually took, I think, some ESG money, but she's off on her own doing her own deal. And we look at deals like, just like with what guys like Tucker Carlson have done, and they're not they're getting rid of that contamination, like you said. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can do it. And man, if anything, I don't want anybody to walk off from this podcast being discouraged.
Yeah, a lot of hope.
Don't think that we're, like Steve said, this isn't something that's going to be easy. I know I've seen Jim talking about this online. I've listened to Margaret in person and online. I really do appreciate people like you that make it your everyday deal to try to tell other people what's going on. And I want to thank you guys for being a part of this today. Do either one of y'all have anything else that you'd want to add before we kind of end this interview?
Well, the only thing I would say is don't count yourself short in this. You know, we were warned by our founders that we would lose the republic if we didn't have an educated citizenry. So even pulling us together today to have this conversation that then others can listen to, I think is very fruitful. And so we can't underestimate that value of what you two are doing as well on these issues. So thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. I guess that's what I was said too. Like, this has been a good discussion. It gets me thinking about different things too. And so, yeah, when people have a chance to sit down and talk about it, that's what they need to do. Because it helps when you're not talking to some salesman, you know, that's come into your living room trying to get you to do whatever. If you talk to your neighbors and see what they're thinking too. It's been good. So
Jim, you know what I believe would have been good for America?
What's that?
Iowa girls would have won the other day.
Yeah, it's been like, I don't know if I'm looking forward to it or what, but I know every time I travel, oh, you're from Iowa? Boy, you got quite the ball player up there.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, it's been fun to watch. That's been a fun distraction, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
I just want to throw that in there right quick.
Well,
yeah.
You guys, it really was a treat to have y'all out here for the folks that watch our podcast. And if there's ever a time that you guys want to come back and bring us some issues or kind of circle back up and revisit these issues, I'd love to be sitting here in a year or two talking about how much progress we've made from this talk that we started today. So maybe we can do that. And
yeah, I was planning on that.
Yeah, let's do that. Well, guys, thank y'all for being here today. We appreciate y'all being a part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching Gun and Saddle, a United Country M. Edwards Realty and Auction weekly podcast. Have an idea for a future episode, comments, or suggestions? Email us at comments@gunandsaddle.com. Remember to subscribe or follow us today. Join us again next week for a deeper look at the land we all love and the people that call it home. This is Gun and Saddle.